Hey guys, and welcome to Cinematic Passport, your gateway to the world of international cinema. That's right, folks. Cinematic Passport is a brand new channel, fresh and ready to dive into the captivating world of movies and TV shows. But hold on to your popcorn because here's the deal. We're not afraid to dive deep into the heart of these stories, which means we'll be serving up some pretty heavy spoilers along the way. So before you join us for our reviews and discussions, make sure you've watched the series we're talking about. Trust us, you won't want to miss out on the excitement. So, grab your passport, pack your imagination, and let's set sail to the world of cinema together. Welcome aboard, fellow travelers. So, for the very first series we'll be reviewing and discussing will be Netflix's A Killer Paradox. The show came out on February 9, 2024, and is classified as a crime thriller and dark comedy. However, I personally wouldn't really call it a comedy. So, the premise of the show is that our main lead accidentally kills someone, and in order to cover up that crime, he finds himself having to commit murders again and again. The main lead of this show is Chu Woo Sik, and he'll be playing Lee Tang, our accidental serial killer. If he looks a little bit familiar, that might be from the movie Parasite if you've watched him. While our second lead is played by Sun Suk, he plays Jang Nan Gum, our detective. By the way, guys, if I mess up any of the pronunciations, please drop it down in the comment box. Let me know how it is supposed to sound. Carrying on, you might recognize him from shows such as Sense8. All right, now starting with the show. Our very first scene starts by introducing us to Lee Tang's family. In this scene, we learn that he wants to travel to Canada for work experience to pick up some strawberries, I guess. Well, the show doesn't really dive into why he wants to go to Canada. However, just from judging it based off the first scene, I think it's some kind of dream that our lead has, a kind of escape that he creates, which, to be fair, we all have one of them. The second scene introduces us to Tang's university's friends. Here we get a little bit more picture of who he is, and we can see that he's not really that popular and only has two friends. The importance of the scene is really to show us that there's nothing out of the ordinary when it comes to Li Tang. If you think about it, viewers can kind of see themselves in him. Think about it. All we do is either we go to class, we go to work, hang out with our small group of friends, and that's basically how all our lives look like. So, unlike other shows where they show the main lead or the serial killer as being disturbed or having some sort of traumatic childhood. And this show shows us that Lee is pretty ordinary guy. So the series really starts to pick up from the convenience store, or should I say the killing starts to pick up from this convenience store. In the convenience store, we meet this drunken man who is, by the way, a huge menace. Like not only is he completely drunk, but he's also extremely rude to Lee. Thankfully for Lee, a second elderly man walks in who seems much more politer than the first guy, even apologizing for his friend and telling Lee that he reminds him of his son. Unfortunately, however, we find out that this will in fact be Lee's first victim. Later on, after his shift, as he's walking home, he sees the rude guy, lying on the ground. Now, of course, at this point in time, Lee is more or less pretty normal, pretty average, and just assumed that the guy had way too much to drink and has blacked out on the street. He later on sees the second guy, the friendly guy, quote unquote, and tries to tell him, like, hey, your friend's passed out and it's about to rain. Why don't you just go get your friend and take him home, right? However, the second guy, who at first was really quite nice and very polite, starts being rude to Lee and basically starts insulting him, telling him to get out of there. When he notices Lee making a hand gesture at him, he gets irritated and starts knocking Lee around. At this point, we get a flashback of Lee's school life. Here, we see that he was in fact bullied a bit. Something that is quite interesting to me at the very least is we notice that the bullies tell him, like, hey, join us and beat up this guy. And what for me stands out here is rather than joining the bullies, because let's be honest, that would probably have saved him from getting hit as well, he instead decides not to join them, which then leads them to beating on him. So, what this tells me at the very least is that earlier on, Lee was not exactly prone to violence, and he was someone that would rather take a punch than give a punch. However, this completely changes in the future, where Lee seems to just snap, which of course leads us to the scene. From Lee's face, we can see that he is clearly and visibly shocked. Again, I think this just goes to show that this was not really part of Lee's character. He was not, again, he was not exactly prone to violence. So knowing that he killed someone has to be quite shocking. Something else that I would like to add in this scene is okay, personally, I've never killed anyone. However, I think it is actually a little bit realistic. If you hit someone on the head with a hammer, right? You would expect them to be a bit dazed and maybe to be a bit confused. And the scene where he keeps banging himself into the door kind of reminds me of a zombie. Like he's trying to walk straight, not understanding that you can't pass there. There's a door, there's a gate. So that just goes to show that the brain was really affected by the impact of the hammer. Moving on, in this scene, we notice that there is, unfortunately for Lee, a witness. However, it's a blind girl. And anybody who's watched more than one movie could pretty much guess what the twist was gonna be here and that she's not actually blind. But we'll get back to her later on. So, moving on from the crime scene, the very next day is when we meet our second lead, our detective. In this scene, we realize that the hammer that Lee had forgotten to take away, aka the murder weapon, is missing from the crime scene due to the fact that the hammer is not on the crime scene and that the blood of the mean guy, that's what we'll call him, was found in the backpack of the nice guy, quote unquote nice guy, the cops believe that they murdered each other, which thankfully for Lee, this is pretty good news for him. However, they did find a paper bag from the convenience store when they were last there earlier, which then leaves our detective to go to the convenience store and question Lee. Because the cops believe that the two men killed each other, Lee was not really viewed as a suspect at that time, but rather more as a witness or the last person to see them alive. So the conversation was more about what did you hear from them? Could you tell me anything about the two men? And etc. Something else in this scene is we meet these two delinquents. Now, we're not really told what the story is. Scene, we see our detective reviewing the surveillance footage of the convenience store. And luckily for Lee, once again, such an extremely lucky guy, the moment he picks up the hammer to ask the owner to borrow it, a fly just happens to land on the camera, obstructing the detective's view. Therefore, he's not able to see the hammer. Later on, we find out at the same time as Lee that this Lee's victim was actually a serial killer who had been wanted by the police for the last few decades. Now, this, of course, is news to Lee. Obviously, he didn't know this fact before. This news, of course, affects Lee. Throughout the episode, we noticed that he was being haunted by visions of the man he had killed, which is more than logical. He thought he killed an innocent man, a hardworking man who had a mother with dementia as well as children. However, upon learning that he in fact killed a serial killer, this changes everything. And we see that in this scene as it symbolically represents Lee's guilt fading away. He now no longer feels responsible for the death of an innocent man, but I believe he sees it more as karma. He killed a monster, so that really doesn't count, right? Or at least that's what he tells himself. And this is how we end episode one. Jumping straight into episode 2, we do see that even though Lee's guilt might not be as strong, the fact that he killed someone still lingers with him. The fact that he's seeing hallucinations everywhere he goes is a strong inkling of what probably might happen later on in the show. I suspect that the more Lee kills or accidentally kills, we'll find out, the more of an effect this will have in Lee's psyche and the more it will trouble him. So, in this episode, we find out a little bit more about our detective. We learn that his father is actually in a coma, his mother taking care of his father, although we're not exactly told what led to his father being in a coma. My prediction is that the father is probably a killer. Yep, that's my prediction. I think that the father got into an accident, either running away from a crime scene or as he was trying to cover up a crime scene. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that I'm going too far with my prediction? Do you think that it's way off? Or do you guys agree with me? I think it's a little bit suspicious how we're shown Lee's father in a coma, but we're not exactly told what the story there is. If there's anything I've learned from my numerous thousands and hundreds of hours on watching TV, is that whenever you're not given a backstory, there's always something there you should know of. Later on in this episode, we see the detectives back at the precinct. Here, we discover that he's obsessed in hunting down an old ex cop. Now, personally, I think this ex cop might have been his partner, which might explain his obsession. And though we are not told exactly what led to him becoming a criminal, my best guess is he couldn't serve justice. Maybe he couldn't get enough evidence and therefore decided to take justice into his own hands. Or maybe he was a crooked cop. What do you guys think? Let me know what you think down in the comment section. And of course, this leads us to our scene with the blind girl who, surprise, surprise to nobody, turned out not to be blind. It turns out she had an accident while she was younger that left her scarred, and therefore she wears her glasses to hide her scarring. So, in this scene, we learn that she is now going to blackmail our Lee, demands 2 million won, that's roughly $1,500, in exchange for the hammer that she picked up from this crime scene. Yep, that's right. The reason that the hammer was missing from the crime scene was because she doubled back and took it with her, wrapped it in foil, and decided to blackmail Lee about it. Later on in this episode, we see Lee going to her apartment with the money that he has taken. However, upon giving her the money, we find out that she plans on blackmailing him for the rest of her life. Now, personally, I think this part is a little bit retarded, and I say this as if I was blackmailing someone, right? The last thing I would do is A, invite him to where I live alone, and B, tell him that I'm going to keep blackmailing him when we are alone together in my apartment where nobody else is living. Personally, and again, I've never blackmailed anyone, but I think she would have done it in a public place, a place with lots of witnesses around. In fact, I would not communicate with him and through text message or anything like that where he might be able to find out where I live. No, I would be smart about it. I would either come to where he is working, the convenience store, set up a time and meeting somewhere far away from where I live, and hell, I would make sure to grab a taxi, go somewhere else, grab a metro, just ring around so in case he follows you, you try lose him somewhere, right? But that's not what she does. Instead, she goes ahead and decides to blackmail him or continue blackmailing him when they're alone in her apartment. Now, obviously, our Lee here feels some type of way. We see that he now feels that he is going to be at her beck and call, basically a dog. And this is what this scene represents. And because of that, he once again flips a switch in his head and decides to use the hammer again to kill her, which, by the way, he's really making use of that hammer. Like, wow. Anyways, that's beside this point. Our Wali here hits her on the head with the hammer, takes his money, and runs away. Another point I want to bring up is for someone who is very impulsive, he really is reactive. Like, I'm sorry, but she did say, like, hey, your DNA is gonna be everywhere in my house, so that's why you're not gonna kill me. But what was stopping him from, I don't know, cleaning up the murder scene? Like, she does live alone. It's not like she was expecting anybody. Like he could have easily wiped everything, wiped the chair, made sure to remove his fingerprints from the cup. Like, but no, he didn't. Instead, he just grabs everything and runs out. And this is an important point that will come back up later. So, a little bit later in the episode, obviously, they notice that the blind girl has not been picking up her milk, which leads them to call the police, which leads them to finding her body. Now, while they're in her house, we discover that Lee's second victim is also a killer. What are the odds, right? Turns out that she had murdered her parents 5 years ago and buried their bodies in the backyard. Turns out again that she had filed 12 different life insurance policies on her parents. Now, I may not be from Korea, but I am a bit curious. Is that not a bit suspicious? Like, okay, one life policy granted, that's fine. Two, maybe, I guess, but 12? And then the parents disappear. Like, no one thought it was suspicious. No one thought, let's look into it. No one thought, like, was it never mentioned? Like, oh, we had our eye on her. We suspected her of foul play, but we couldn't prove anything. But nope, turns out it somehow went under the radar, I guess. But anyway, moving on. Later on in the precinct, we discovered that due to her dog, who ended up eating her face, they couldn't actually determine the cause of death. Furthermore, we discovered that the dog happened to drool all over the house, meaning that the crime scene had been contaminated, meaning that they couldn't get any DNA evidence from the crime scene. Now, I'm curious, what do you guys think? Do you guys think that this is just a bit of luck on Lee's part, that he has animals contaminating scenes for him? First the fly on the camera, now the dog drooling all over the apartment. To be fair, the dog, I will understand that part because it was locked up in the house. So I understand the dog eating the owner, but drooling all over the apartment. Or do you think this is just plot armor as a way to make our detective not yet suspect Lee? Now, continuing with Lee, obviously he doesn't know that the second victim he killed is also a murderer. So we now see how this is affecting Lee, and he turns out he was on the verge of leaving, let's just say that, when he's interrupted by his friend knocking on his door, obviously concerned about Lee, seeing as he has not been coming to school and has not been going to work. Now, what's quite interesting about this scene, at least for me, is that earlier on in the episode, Lee mentioned how he thought that he was quite lucky and recalled an incident in high school when he had stolen his friend's tablet without the friend realizing that it was him who stole the tablet. So he mentioned that he had always been lucky and luck had always been on his side. And he brought up that incident to his friend, talking about, oh, you don't even know anything, just to find out that his friend was actually on to him and knew the truth the whole time. It turned out that the friend just didn't say anything as they were each other's only friends, and he didn't want to rock the boat and potentially end up losing the only friend in high school. So he kind of played it dumb, which then begs the question, does Lee have luck on his side, or is it just a bunch of coincidences? Later on in the episode, we see one of the other cops taking the dog for a walk when his path crosses those two teens that we had met earlier on in episode one. The teens, of course, who were mad that they were taken down to the precinct and were quote unquote manhandled, decided to take their revenge and unfortunately decided to stab the poor detective. Moving on, we see Lee, who looks clearly distraught from the fact that he killed somebody else, learning that the woman he killed is also a murderer. Now, for me, this scene is a bit kind of changes things for Lee because now I don't know why, but I kind of get the sense that he is changing perspective. He now might see this as his mission in life. He might see this as a calling from above, that what he's doing is actually planned, that maybe he thinks that the universe is using him to serve out justice. And you can see this from his demeanor, from the way he's looking. And there's just something about this scene that tells us that the old Lee, who probably felt remorse for killing people, is slowly but surely fading away. And instead, we're getting this new Lee that might have convinced himself that, hey, I'm just doing what the universe wants me to do. And I think this is what's going to enable Lee to continue this killing, because obviously these are not going to be his only two victims. Of course, we see this clearly when his path comes across the two teenagers who just came from stabbing the cop. While they were busy harassing him, asking him for cigarette, he notices some blood spots on their t-shirt and takes this as a sign for, hey, the universe has put two more victims in front of me to get justice for. Without even really bothering to find out, we end up fast forwarding and seeing the two teenage boys dead. So obviously, we now know that Lee has built up four victims in a span of what, a week or so? Yes, and that is where episode 2 ends of The Killer Paradox. Now, personally, I think this show really has a lot of potential. It kind of reminds me of Dexter, but an accidental Dexter, at least the very first two episodes. I think going further into this season, we will probably see him scouting out criminals to purposely kill rather than accidentally killing. Fun enough, the show also somehow for me resembles Death Note. I don't know what it is. I think it's the whole criminal being chased by a very smart cop, because the detective we can see is no fool. He seems very smart and he seems like he will be a problem for Lee, and it will very much be a cat and mouse kind of show. So I'm curious how the next few episodes are going. Now, guys, of course, this is a brand new channel, as you guys can probably guess from the everything. So please, 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 I would truly appreciate it if you could like, leave a comment, tell me what your predictions are when it comes to this season. And of course, please subscribe. Thank you so much, guys. I will see you next time for episode 3 and 4.